I spent 14 months seriously researching 2 other countries before I ever seriously considered the Philippines. Thailand first, then Mexico, both for good reasons, both with passionate communities of American retirees who will tell you, with total sincerity, that they made the right choice. I want to tell you why I ultimately chose neither, and why, 2 years into retiring in the Philippines instead, I think the comparison actually matters more than most of these videos let on. This isn't a video telling you Thailand or Mexico are bad choices. Plenty of people build wonderful lives in both. This is a video walking you through the actual line-by-line comparison I built as a retired accountant. The same way I once built comparisons for corporate clients, deciding between competing investments. Because I think most people make this decision on vibes and Instagram photos rather than an honest side-by-side. I watched, during my own research phase, dozens of videos that amounted to little more than a beautiful sunset and a vague claim about affordability. And I remember feeling genuinely frustrated that nobody seemed willing to show their actual math. This video is my attempt to be the resource I wish I'd found 14 months earlier. Stick with me. I'm going to show you my actual spreadsheet, and I'm going to be honest about where the other 2 countries genuinely beat the Philippines, because a comparison you can't trust isn't worth making. I've been an accountant for nearly 4 decades, and if there's one professional habit that's followed me into retirement, it's a deep discomfort with conclusions that aren't backed by an actual, checkable number. I built this comparison originally for myself, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 14 months before I ever boarded a flight to any of these 3 countries, and I've kept updating it ever since, precisely because a spreadsheet that stops getting checked against reality is worth exactly as much as a hunch. I spent 39 years as an accountant, the last 15 running my own small practice, mostly serving local businesses in the town where I'd lived my entire adult life. My wife passed 4 years before I retired. Ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. And by the time I actually stopped working at 65, I was looking, honestly, for a complete change of scenery, as much as I was looking for financial efficiency. I mention her specifically because I think grief was part of what made me approach this decision with unusual thoroughness. I had time, and a specific kind of restless energy that a busier or more attached life might not have afforded me.
Thailand was the obvious first stop in my research. It has, by far, the largest and most established retiree infrastructure of any Southeast Asian country, decades of expat communities, extensive online resources, and a retirement visa system that's been operating long enough to have well-documented processes.
I spent 4 months building out a detailed cost comparison for 3 Thai cities, joined half a dozen forums, and even started a basic language course, genuinely intending to make Thailand my choice. The numbers looked good. Chiang Mai, specifically, offered a genuinely low cost of living, a huge established expat community, and excellent healthcare infrastructure. I want to be fair to Thailand throughout this video, because I think it deserves fairness. For a large portion of American retirees, it remains an excellent choice, and I don't want anyone to walk away from this thinking otherwise. I've kept in touch with several people from that trip, specifically because I genuinely respect the life they've built there, and nothing in this comparison is meant to suggest their choice was wrong. It simply wasn't the right choice for my own specific circumstances, which is a different claim entirely, and one I want to keep separate throughout everything that follows. I actually flew to Chiang Mai for a 3-week exploratory visit during that research period, the same disciplined approach I'd apply to due diligence on any significant financial decision. I stayed in 3 different neighborhoods over those 3 weeks, specifically to test the variation in daily experience across areas frequently recommended in the retiree forums. I met with an immigration consultant recommended by 2 separate expat groups, toured 5 apartments, and sat in on an English-language church service specifically to gauge the size and warmth of the existing community. I want to be clear that almost everything about that visit was genuinely pleasant. The food was extraordinary, the temples were beautiful, and the retirees I met were, without exception, warm and welcoming to a stranger, asking a lot of detailed questions. What ultimately moved me away from Thailand wasn't the cost of living or the healthcare. It was two specific practical issues that I think get under-discussed in the more polished retirement videos. First, the retirement visa renewal process in Thailand had, during my research period, become noticeably more complicated than it had been even 5 years earlier. Increased financial requirements, stricter documentation, and a general tightening that several long-term expats in my research forums described as an ongoing trend rather than a one-time change. I don't fault Thailand for adjusting its own immigration policy to serve its own interests, but I wanted a retirement plan built on a system I felt reasonably confident would remain stable for the next 15 or 20 years, not one actively trending toward more restriction. Second, and this surprised me more, was the language barrier specifically as it applied to healthcare and legal matters outside the major expat hubs. English proficiency, especially among medical staff and government office workers outside Bangkok and Chiang Mai, was less consistent than the polished YouTube videos had led me to expect.
I'm 67. I wanted a country where, if I had a genuine medical emergency, I could communicate clearly with the people treating me, without relying entirely on a translation app, or a fortunate coincidence of finding an English-speaking staff member.
Neither of these issues is dramatic on its own, but as a retired accountant, trained to weigh risk carefully rather than dismiss it because the upside looks appealing, both factors move Thailand from clear first choice to worth reconsidering in my spreadsheet. I want to give one specific example that stuck with me from that exploratory visit. I accompanied a fellow retiree, a man I'd met through the forums, to a routine dermatology appointment at a clinic he'd used for 2 years without previous issue. The specific doctor he normally saw was unavailable that day, and the substitute physician's English proficiency was limited enough that a fairly simple explanation of a minor skin concern took nearly 20 minutes of halting communication to fully convey. My friend, who'd built his own considerable comfort with the local language over 2 years, still found himself frustrated by the exchange. I remember thinking, watching that interaction, about what a genuinely urgent situation might look like under those same communication conditions, at an age where medical urgency becomes statistically more likely with each passing year. Mexico was the natural second stop. Given proximity to the United States, an enormous and well-established American retiree community, and, for many people, the appeal of remaining within a few hours' flight of family back home. I spent 3 months researching specifically, focusing on 2 cities frequently recommended in retiree communities, one coastal, one in the Central Highlands. The proximity advantage is real and significant, and I want to give it full credit. For anyone with grandchildren they want to see regularly, or aging parents they might need to reach quickly, Mexico's geographic closeness to the United States is a genuine, substantial benefit that neither Thailand nor the Philippines can match. The healthcare infrastructure in the cities I researched was excellent, often staffed by physicians trained partly in the United States, with far more consistent English proficiency in medical settings than I'd found researching Thailand. The cost of living, while higher than either Thailand or the Philippines in most categories, remained dramatically lower than staying in the United States. I made a similar exploratory trip to Mexico, 2 separate visits actually, 3 weeks split between my 2 target cities. The healthcare experience genuinely impressed me. I sat in on a friend of a friend's routine cardiology follow-up specifically to observe the interaction, and the physician's English was essentially seamless, trained partly at a university in the American Midwest. The overall infrastructure, restaurants, transportation, general day-to-day comfort, felt noticeably more familiar to an American visitor than my Thailand experience had, which I understood intellectually as a function of geographic and cultural proximity, but still found genuinely reassuring during those exploratory weeks. 2 specific factors ultimately moved me away from Mexico, and I want to be precise about both, because I think vague safety concerns get thrown around carelessly in these comparison videos without real specificity. First, the cost of living, while lower than the United States, was noticeably higher than either Thailand or the Philippines in the specific cities I researched. driven significantly by demand from the large existing American retiree population, which has, over decades, pushed housing and certain goods pricing upward in the most popular expat areas specifically. This is a well-documented pattern economists call the gringo pricing effect, and while it's not universal across the entire country, it was a consistent factor in the two cities I'd narrowed my search to. Second, and this was a more personal consideration, safety perceptions varied significantly by specific region in a way that required much more granular, city-by-city research than either of my other two options. I want to be careful and fair here, because broad claims about safety in Mexico tend to flatten an enormous, genuinely diverse country into an unfair single narrative. But as a single retiree in my mid-60s, without a spouse to share situational awareness with, I found myself wanting a level of confidence in daily life safety that required extensive, ongoing research just to maintain, city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, in a way that felt, ultimately, like more active risk management than I wanted my retirement to require. I want to repeat, because I think it matters for fairness. Countless American retirees build wonderful, secure lives in Mexico. My conclusion was specific to my own risk tolerance, my own single status, and my own research into the particular cities I'd narrowed my search to. It is not a universal claim about the entire country. I also want to mention a specific financial factor that surprised me during that research. Property and rental price trends in my two target cities showed a consistent upward pattern over the preceding 5 years, driven partly by growing American retiree demand and partly by broader economic factors specific to those regions. A rental that might have cost $400 monthly 5 years earlier had, in several documented cases I found in my research, climbed to nearly $600 by the time of my visit. That trajectory concerned me as someone planning a fixed-income retirement, expected to last 15 or 20 years. I wanted a location where I had reasonable confidence my core housing cost wouldn't be steadily eroded by the same demand I was personally contributing to. The Philippines entered my research almost by accident, through a former client of my accounting practice who'd retired there 4 years earlier and mentioned it during what was otherwise an ordinary phone call about an unrelated matter. What struck me immediately, once I started researching seriously, was a specific combination of factors I hadn't found together in either previous country. Widespread English proficiency, a direct legacy of the country's educational system and history, meaning I could expect to communicate clearly with medical staff, government offices, and everyday service providers without relying heavily on translation. A retirement visa system that had remained comparatively stable over the preceding decade, without the tightening trend I'd found concerning in Thailand, and a cost of living that, in the specific cities I researched, came in noticeably lower than my Mexico research, closer to my Thailand figures, without the gringo pricing effect I'd found concerning there. I built out the same detailed spreadsheet I'd built for the other two countries, and for the first time in 14 months of research, every major category – cost, language access, visa stability, healthcare access, safety research – landed in a genuinely favorable position simultaneously, rather than requiring me to accept a significant trade-off in one category to gain an advantage in another. I made a third exploratory visit, following the same 3-week discipline I'd applied to the other two countries, and stayed in 2 different cities, specifically to compare urban versus smaller coastal options. My former client met me during the first week, walked me through his own 2-bedroom apartment and monthly budget in detail, and connected me with 3 other retirees he'd built friendships with over his 4 years there. I toured 6 apartments across the 2 cities, visited 2 hospitals specifically to observe patient-staff communication in real time rather than relying solely on online reviews, and sat in on a Sunday service at a local parish specifically to gauge, the same way I had in Thailand, the warmth and accessibility of the existing English-speaking community. What struck me most during that visit wasn't any single dramatic moment, but the cumulative absence of the specific friction points I'd catalogued in my other 2 research trips. I never once struggled to make myself understood. I never once found myself doing currency-adjusted mental math about whether a price felt inflated for foreigners. I never once felt the low-grade vigilance about neighborhood safety that had colored parts of my Mexico research. The visit simply confirmed, city block by city block, conversation by conversation, what the spreadsheet had already begun to suggest. Here's the actual comparison. The numbers I built as a retired accountant, comparing 3 real options rather than 3 marketing pitches. For a comfortable one-bedroom apartment in a safe, established area, not luxury, not the cheapest available, but genuinely comfortable, my Thailand research averaged around $400 monthly in Chiang Mai. My Mexico research averaged around $550 in my 2 target cities, reflecting that gringo pricing effect. My actual rent here in the Philippines comes to $340 monthly. Groceries and food followed a similar pattern. My Thailand estimate around $200 monthly, Mexico around $260, and my actual grocery and dining spending here landing around $220. Higher than Thailand's estimate, but with the language and healthcare advantages I valued more heavily in my final decision. Healthcare, specifically supplemental insurance plus typical out-of-pocket costs, came to roughly $90 monthly in my Thailand research, around $110 in Mexico given the higher quality but more expensive private facilities I'd targeted there, and about $85 monthly in my actual Philippines budget, reflecting a comparable quality of care at a lower baseline cost. Add transportation, utilities, and modest discretionary spending, and my final actual monthly total here comes to just under $960, comfortably under the $1,000 mark, and lower than either of my careful projections for Thailand or Mexico, while also solving the 2 specific concerns, language access and visa stability, that had moved me away from Thailand in the first place. I want to include one more line item that I think gets skipped in most of these comparison videos, the annual visa renewal and associated fees, which I tracked carefully across all 3 countries during my research and have now verified against 2 years of actual bills here. My Philippines retirement visa, once initially secured, requires a modest annual reporting fee that comes to roughly $60 total for the year, averaging to about $5 monthly, a figure my research suggested was noticeably lower and more predictable than the Thailand renewal costs I'd projected, which several forum members reported had increased twice during my own 14-month research window alone. I promised you an honest comparison, not a sales pitch, and I want to keep that promise by being direct about where the Philippines genuinely loses to the other 2 options, because I think this matters for anyone using this video to make their own decision. Mexico wins decisively on proximity to the United States. If regular in-person time with grandchildren or aging parents back home is a top priority, no honest comparison can put the Philippines ahead of Mexico on that specific factor. A 14-hour flight is simply a different category of distance than a 2- or 3-hour flight. Thailand wins, in many specific cities, on the sheer scale and maturity of its expat infrastructure, decades longer established than the Philippines' comparable communities in most cities, meaning a slightly wider range of specifically Western amenities and a somewhat larger pool of established social groups to plug into immediately upon arrival, in certain cities specifically. Both countries also offer, in specific regions, natural beauty and tourist infrastructure that in some cases exceeds what I've found in my specific city here. I want to be genuinely fair about this, because I think comparison videos that pretend one option wins everything usually aren't being honest with their audience. I'd also add that climate preference is entirely subjective and worth mentioning honestly. Northern Thailand's cooler, drier season appeals to people who find year-round tropical humidity uncomfortable, an experience I don't share personally, but which several forum acquaintances cited as their primary reason for ultimately choosing Chiang Mai over more humid alternatives. And Mexico's higher elevation cities offer a genuinely temperate, spring-like climate for much of the year that neither Thailand nor the Philippines can match, since both remain firmly tropical, regardless of season or specific city choice. If climate is your single highest priority, that factor alone might reasonably outweigh everything else in this comparison. I don't want to pretend my spreadsheet translated perfectly into lived experience without any friction, because that wouldn't be honest either.
My first 3 months here were harder than the numbers predicted, in ways that had nothing to do with the specific factors I'd compared across the 3 countries. The ordinary loneliness of arriving alone in an unfamiliar place, the adjustment to a completely different daily rhythm, the small homesickness that no amount of favorable spreadsheet math fully prevents. All of that arrived regardless of which of the 3 countries I'd chosen, and I think it's worth saying plainly that no comparison, however careful, eliminates the emotional adjustment period entirely.
What the careful comparison did provide, though, was a foundation that made that adjustment period more manageable than it might otherwise have been. Because I could communicate clearly in English with my landlord, my doctor, and my neighbors, the ordinary logistics of building a new life proceeded more smoothly than I suspect they would have in a location requiring more translation-dependent daily interaction. By month 4, I'd joined a small group of retirees, mostly through a local expat association meeting recommended by my former client, and the initial isolation had genuinely started to lift. I remember a specific incident from my second month that I think illustrates this well. My apartment's water heater failed on a Sunday evening, and rather than the panicked, translation app-assisted scramble I'd worried about during my Thailand research, I simply called my landlord directly, explained the issue clearly in English, and had a repair technician at my door within 2 hours who also spoke enough English to walk me through what had gone wrong and how to prevent it recurring. It was an entirely unremarkable interaction, and I think that unremarkableness is exactly the point. The value of the language advantage isn't found in dramatic emergencies alone. It's found in the accumulated ease of 100 small, ordinary interactions that simply require less energy and less anxiety than they would elsewhere. 2 years in, I want to describe what an actual week looks like, because I think the spreadsheet only tells part of the story. I have a standing Tuesday breakfast with 3 other retirees, 2 Americans and 1 Australian, at a small cafe near my apartment, where the owner has learned my order well enough to start preparing it before I've fully sat down. I volunteer twice a month with a local literacy program, drawing on decades of patient, methodical explanation skills that 39 years of accounting apparently prepared me for, in ways I hadn't expected. I've started, somewhat to my own surprise, learning to cook several local dishes, taught patiently by a neighbor who noticed me struggling with unfamiliar market ingredients during my first month and simply started walking me through them. My daughter visited 6 months ago, her first trip, and spent much of the visit remarking on how functional and settled everything felt. My ability to navigate the market, negotiate minor logistics, and generally operate as a competent resident rather than a confused tourist, all of which she credited, correctly I think, to the clear communication the language advantage had afforded me from nearly the first week. I've also stayed loosely connected with 2 of the people I met during my Thailand and Mexico exploratory visits, both of whom eventually settled in those respective countries rather than following me here. We compare notes occasionally, more out of genuine friendship than any lingering sense of competition between our choices. My friend in Chiang Mai reports being thoroughly happy, genuinely, and has navigated the visa tightening I'd worried about without serious issue so far, though he acknowledges it requires more active monitoring than it once did. My acquaintance in Mexico echoes similar contentment, particularly valuing the ease of frequent visits from his 3 grandchildren, a benefit I don't have access to here and don't pretend to. Neither of them regrets their choice, and I don't think either of them should. We simply weighted our own specific priorities differently and ended up, appropriately, in 3 different countries. I want to revisit my original 3-country comparison now, with 2 full years of actual lived experience rather than 14 months of research, because I think hindsight is worth being honest about too. The visa stability concern that moved me away from Thailand has, if anything, been reinforced by the actual experience of maintaining my own Philippines visa over 2 years, without the kind of tightening several Thailand-based friends in my online research groups have continued to report to me since. The language advantage has mattered more, not less, than I initially predicted. Nearly every meaningful interaction, from my hip specialist consultation last year to a minor dispute with a delivery service, was resolved through clear, direct English communication that I believe would have taken considerably more effort in either of the other 2 countries. The one factor I underweighted in my original comparison was the depth of community available specifically to English-speaking retirees here, which I'd assumed, based on Thailand's more established reputation, might be thinner. It wasn't. The community I found, through that first expat association meeting, has proven every bit as rich and socially sustaining as anything I researched in either other country, simply organized somewhat differently. I've also had 2 years to test something I couldn't have verified during research alone: how the healthcare system performs under genuine, unplanned stress rather than a scheduled observation visit. I had a kidney stone 11 months ago, a genuinely painful, urgent situation requiring same-day treatment. The entire process, from the moment I called a taxi to the moment I was discharged with clear aftercare instructions I fully understood without needing to ask for repetition, took under 6 hours and cost, out of pocket after my supplemental insurance, less than $90. I called my Thailand-based friend afterward, partly to check in, partly out of curiosity, and he estimated a comparable emergency in his own city, outside the main hospital district, might have taken considerably longer to navigate given the specific area of Chiang Mai he lives in, purely due to the language and logistics involved in an unplanned, non-English-speaking urgent care setting.
If you're currently doing your own version of this 3-country comparison, or a similar comparison among other options, here's what I'd actually recommend, as someone who spent 14 months building this the careful way.
Build a real spreadsheet, not a mental impression. Include not just cost of living, but language access specifically for medical and legal situations, visa stability trends over the preceding decade rather than just current requirements, and an honest assessment of your own risk tolerance for research-intensive safety navigation versus a location where that navigation is less demanding. Weight the factors according to your actual life circumstances, not a generic ranking. If proximity to grandchildren matters more to you than it did to me, Mexico may be the genuinely correct answer, despite my own conclusion.
If you're moving as a couple rather than alone, the safety research burden that concerned me specifically as a single retiree may weigh less heavily in your own calculation. There is no universal winner among these 3 countries. There is only the winner for your specific, honestly assessed priorities. I'd also recommend, strongly, doing what I did, and what I think too many people skip, in favor of relying entirely on online research. An actual exploratory visit to your top 1 or 2 choices before committing to anything permanent. I spent roughly 9 weeks total across 3 separate trips, a real financial and time investment, but one that I believe saved me from a far more costly mistake of committing permanently to a location based on research alone, only to discover a friction point in person that no forum post had adequately conveyed. If your budget or timeline doesn't allow multiple full exploratory trips, prioritize at minimum a single 2 to 3 week visit to your leading choice, structured deliberately to test daily logistics rather than simply enjoying a vacation. I titled this video the way I did because I think too many retirement comparison videos pretend there's one obviously correct answer, when the honest truth, from someone who spent 14 months building a real comparison, is that all 3 countries can be the right choice for the right person. For me, specifically, a single retiree in his mid-60s, prioritizing clear communication in medical and legal situations, wanting visa stability over the following 15 to 20 years, and preferring a lower research burden around daily safety navigation, the Philippines won decisively, on both the spreadsheet and, 2 years later, in actual lived experience. Under $1,000 a month, comfortably, for a life I genuinely enjoy rather than merely tolerate. I still have the original spreadsheet, all 3 tabs,
sitting in a folder on my laptop. I look at it occasionally, not out of second guessing, but the same way I used to review a closed client file after a completed engagement, checking whether the analysis held up against what actually happened. 2 years later, mine has held up remarkably well, closer to my projections than I honestly expected any single piece of research to land once real life got involved. I think that's the actual lesson underneath this entire comparison, more than any specific country's advantages. Careful, honest, fairly weighted research, tested against real experience rather than assumption, tends to serve you well regardless of which specific country ends up winning your particular spreadsheet. If you're building your own comparison right now, I genuinely encourage you to do what I did. Research honestly, weight the factors according to your own actual priorities rather than someone else's, and don't let any single video, including this one, make the decision for you without your own real spreadsheet behind it. Drop your own priorities in the comments, and I'll do my best to share what I found relevant to those specific factors during my own research. I read every comment, and given how much this particular comparison seems to matter to people currently sitting where I once sat, 14 months into an uncertain decision, I'm genuinely glad to walk through the specific line items with anyone who asks. I'll see you in the next one, and whichever country your own spreadsheet eventually points toward, I hope it serves you as well as mine has served me. Good luck with the math.